What if America's most trusted stage helped normalize racism without ever saying the word? For more than 20 years, Ed Sullivan stood before a nation of over 50 million viewers every Sunday night. His stage didn't just entertain. It certified one appearance could transform an unknown into a star, turn applause into authority, and make a performer feel safe from scrutiny. When Ed Sullivan introduced someone, America listened. Sullivan understood that power. According to those who worked closest with him, he never saw himself as just a host. He saw himself as a gatekeeper. He watched carefully. He kept notes, not only about talent, but about behavior, what happened backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience went home. What troubled him most was not diva behavior or oversized egos. It was something quieter, something easier to ignore. Over time, Sullivan began to realize that some of the performers he had helped elevate carried documented racial attitudes that clashed directly with the values his show claimed to represent. Racism that didn't shout, racism that smiled, racism wrapped in patriotism, tradition, or carefully curated wholesomeness. And most disturbingly, these were often the performers America loved the most. Every appearance on Sullivan's stage offered more than exposure. It offered approval. It told millions of viewers that these figures were worthy of admiration and trust. Yet behind the scenes, staff recalled moments of discomfort, demands for segregation, silent exclusions, and behavior that revealed a very different reality from the one presented on screen. Sullivan did not always confront what he saw. Ratings mattered. Networks applied pressure. And America, at the time, was not ready to question its heroes. That silence became part of the system. In his later years, Sullivan reportedly reflected on that burden. He could not undo the introductions he had made, but he could recognize the weight of having given a national platform to people whose success existed alongside exclusion and injustice. These are the 7 performers Ed Sullivan is said to have regretted giving that platform to, not because they lacked talent, but because of what they represented once the applause faded. This story does not begin with outrage. It begins with applause. When Sophie Tucker appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, audiences did not see controversy. They saw history. She was introduced with reverence, not as a problem, but as a pioneer, a survivor of an earlier entertainment world. A woman whose very presence was treated as proof that she had earned her place. By the time Tucker stepped onto Sullivan's stage in the years following 1950, her reputation felt untouchable. She was framed as a living bridge to vaudeville's golden age, a reminder of how entertainment used to be before television changed everything. To many viewers, she represented nostalgia, something familiar, comforting, and safely distant from modern conflicts. What most of them did not see was what that earlier world had been built on. Long before television, Tucker's career was shaped on vaudeville stages where blackface was not an exception, but a norm. Early in her career, theater managers reportedly believed her appearance did not fit mainstream expectations. Blackface, they argued, would redirect attention away from her body and toward her voice. It was presented as a practical solution, not a moral choice. Tucker accepted that logic. She performed in blackface well into 1920. Decades later, when reflecting on those years, she never expressed regret. In her own writings, she described blackface as theatrical makeup no different, in her mind, from any other costume worn on stage. The harm it caused was never acknowledged. It was treated as irrelevant. What made this legacy especially troubling was the music itself. Tucker's style drew heavily from black jazz and blues performers. She studied their phrasing, their rhythms, their emotional delivery. Then she carried those elements onto white stages, often performing for audiences who would never attend a show by an actual black singer. The sound traveled. The people behind it did not. According to accounts from musicians who worked with her, Tucker often treated black performers as resources rather than equals. Some recalled her taking credit for arrangements she had not created. Others described a clear hierarchy, one where she stood at the center of the music, while the artists who shaped it remained invisible. By the time she appeared on Sullivan's show, Tucker no longer performed in blackface. But those who worked backstage later recalled that her attitudes had not evolved with the times. A stage manager remembered Tucker watching a young black singer waiting in the wings and remarking that, in her day, someone like that would never have been allowed backstage. There was no anger in the comment, no cruelty, just certainty. That certainty disturbed Sullivan. By 1959, he had begun deliberately featuring more black performers and integrating his production staff. Tucker's remarks did not sound like hatred. They sounded like history refusing to move forward. Sullivan maintained professional courtesy. Tucker's final appearance came in 1963, 2 years before her death. There was no public confrontation, no condemnation, just a quiet decision to stop giving airtime to performers whose worldview belonged to a century that had already passed. Sophie Tucker's racism did not shout. It did not provoke scandal. It simply lingered, preserved by nostalgia and protected by the excuse of age. And that raises a question more uncomfortable than outrage ever could. When something harmful survives long enough to feel normal, does it become harmless, or does it simply become harder to see? When Kate Smith appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, America did not see a performer. It saw a symbol. Her voice had become inseparable from national feeling. When she sang "God Bless America," audiences were encouraged to hear unity, sacrifice, and belonging. Sullivan introduced her not simply as a guest, but as a voice of the country itself. On patriotic broadcasts, her presence carried moral weight. What viewers did not know, and what would surface much later, was how carefully that image had been protected. Long before her television appearances, Smith had recorded songs in the early years of her career that contained explicitly racist themes. Archival recordings from 1931 revealed lyrics that romanticized slavery and reinforced racial hierarchy. At the time, these performances were treated as unremarkable by the industry. Decades later, they would resurface and shock a public that had never been invited to look that far back. But Sullivan did not need to hear those recordings to feel uneasy. According to backstage staff, Smith maintained strict performance conditions. She insisted on segregated audiences well into the years after 1950. When integrated seating was proposed for certain events, she chose to cancel rather than perform. On Sullivan's stage, she reportedly requested that all visible backup singers and musicians be white. Stage managers later recalled objections when black stagehands were positioned where they might be seen on camera. These were not public demands. They were handled quietly, backstage, where controversy could be managed and images preserved. That contradiction troubled Sullivan. By 1956, he had begun featuring more black performers on his program, often in prominent slots. Smith's requirements placed him in a familiar position balancing ratings, tradition, and an evolving sense of responsibility. According to his producers, Sullivan accommodated her conditions to avoid on-air incidents, but privately expressed discomfort with continuing to present her as a national symbol. What disturbed him most was not simply the exclusion itself, but the hypocrisy it revealed. Smith sang "God Bless America" as a song of inclusion, yet her definition of who belonged did not extend to everyone. As one account later summarized Sullivan's frustration, she sang about America, but only meant part of it. Years after both Smith and Sullivan had died, her earlier recordings became public again in 2019. Statues were removed. Tributes were reconsidered. Many responded with a familiar defense that it was a different time. Historians pushed back, noting that it had never been a different time for those who were excluded. Looking back, Sullivan reportedly regretted not questioning that image sooner. He had helped reinforce the idea that patriotism could exist without equality, that a comforting voice could outweigh uncomfortable truths. Kate Smith did not shout hatred. She did not make speeches. Her exclusion was orderly, polite, and wrapped in ceremony. That made it easier to accept, easier to ignore. And perhaps that is why it lasted as long as it did. If a symbol of national unity excludes part of the nation, what is that unity really built on? When Judy Garland appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, America did not just see a star, it saw someone to protect. By that point, Garland's story was already familiar. the child pushed too hard by the studio system, the adult battling addiction, illness, and exhaustion. Sullivan introduced her with unusual gentleness, aware that audiences were watching not just a performer, but a survivor. Her vulnerability had become part of her image. What viewers did not know was that vulnerability does not always create empathy, and it does not automatically create solidarity. Behind the scenes, accounts from musicians and crew members describe a different side of Garland, one that did not match the narrative of the wounded icon. According to multiple memoirs published years later, Garland used racial slurs during rehearsals and sound checks, particularly when frustrated or under the influence. These were not public outbursts. They were casual, offhand remarks, the kind that linger in rooms long after they are spoken. A pianist who toured with Garland in 1964 later recalled the tension her language created among the integrated band. No one challenged her, not because they agreed, but because power moved in one direction. Garland was the star. Everyone else adjusted. Her relationship with black performers reflected the same imbalance. Garland publicly praised talent, but privately avoided sharing power. Her connection to Lena Horne is often cited as an example. While Garland spoke admiringly of Horne, she never advocated for equal billing or equal visibility. Production records show that Garland held approval rights over publicity materials and made no effort to challenge the hierarchy that kept Horne positioned as secondary. On the Judy Garland Show, which aired in 1963 and 1964, black guests appeared occasionally, but rarely as equals. They sang, they smiled, they exited. Comedy sketches and extended segments remained overwhelmingly white, even as other variety programs began to integrate more fully. What made Garland's behavior especially painful was the symbolism attached to her. By the late years of her life, she had become an icon for marginalized communities, someone who represented endurance in the face of cruelty. The discovery that she could inflict harm on others fractured that image. Sullivan was reportedly troubled when staff shared their observations. At first, he dismissed them. Garland's suffering was well documented. Her fragility seemed explanation enough. But as similar stories surfaced from different people, the pattern became harder to ignore. There was no public reckoning. Garland's story was already framed as a tragedy, and tragedies invite forgiveness. When she died in 1969, obituaries focused on her talent, her pain, and the industry that broke her. The accounts of her racist language were largely absent, quietly excluded from the official narrative. Garland's racism was not ideological. It was not organized. It emerged in moments of stress, entitlement, and unchecked authority. That did not make it harmless. It made it easier to excuse. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable truth. If we protect a symbol because it has suffered, do we risk protecting the harm it causes as well? When Pat Boone appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, he was presented as reassurance. He wore white buck shoes. He smiled easily. He sang without danger. At a time when rock and roll was framed as a threat, Boone was introduced as its acceptable alternative, clean, polite, and safe for American living rooms. Sullivan positioned him as a counterweight to rebellion, a performer parents could trust. What audiences did not see was the business model behind that image. Between 1955 and 1959, Boone built a chart-dominating career by recording sanitized covers of songs originally created by black artists. Ain't That a Shame, Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally each had already proven its power before Boone entered the studio. His versions stripped away the urgency, the edge, and the cultural specificity that made the originals matter. According to music historians, Boone's label operated with efficiency. They monitored recordings by black artists, rushed Boone into sessions, then used their access to white radio stations to ensure his versions reached larger audiences first. The result was not competition. It was replacement. Little Richard later described the experience as watching his music be turned into nursery rhymes. Fats Domino saw his innovations climb the charts under someone else's name. Boone became wealthy. The artists who built the sound remained marginalized. What made this more troubling was that Boone's musical success existed alongside documented opposition to racial integration. During the late years of the decade following 1950, Boone publicly supported segregationist positions and expressed discomfort with integrated spaces. His wholesome image concealed a worldview that aligned with exclusion. A backstage incident reported by Sullivan's show staff in 1958 revealed that contradiction clearly. When the possibility of booking a black musical guest on the same episode was discussed, Boone's management reportedly signaled that he preferred not to appear on integrated programs. The request was quiet, professional, easy to accommodate, but it unsettled Sullivan. According to accounts from those close to him, Sullivan began to view Boone's appearances differently. Watching from the wings, he saw a performer whose success depended on black creativity, yet whose comfort depended on distance from black people. The disconnect was difficult to ignore. Boone never publicly acknowledged the ethical imbalance of his career. He did not use his platform to advocate for the artists whose work made him famous. He did not challenge the radio systems that excluded them. His image remained intact, polished by politeness, and protected by the absence of overt hostility. That, perhaps, was the most effective part. Boone did not shout slurs, he did not provoke scandals, he smiled, complied, and benefited. His career demonstrates how cultural theft does not always announce itself as theft. Sometimes it arrives as reassurance. Sullivan would later regard those bookings as mistakes, not because Boone lacked talent, but because the success he represented depended on erasure, a version of progress that moved forward by pushing others out of view. Which raises a question that still lingers. If success is built by replacing the people who created the culture, is that success merely sanitized theft, or something more dangerous because it feels acceptable? Lawrence Welk never appeared dangerous. When he performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, audiences saw champagne music, polite smiles, and a carefully controlled sense of calm. Welk was introduced as a band leader for everyone, someone who made entertainment feel orderly, familiar, and free of conflict. His image suggested neutrality, comfort, safety. That was the illusion. Behind the softness was a rule that never changed. From 1951 through 1982, Lawrence Welk led a nationally televised orchestra for more than 3 decades. During that entire time, not a single black musician appeared in his orchestra, not once. According to musicians who auditioned across those years, the exclusion was not accidental, it was policy. One black trumpet player who auditioned in 1965 later recalled being told that Mr. Welk preferred to keep the orchestra traditional. The meaning was understood immediately. Traditional meant white. What made Welk's exclusion particularly striking was how long it lasted. As civil rights protests reshaped American culture, other television programs slowly and imperfectly began to integrate. Welk did not. Network diversity reports repeatedly flagged his show as one of the least diverse programs on television. Nothing changed. Former orchestra members later confirmed that Welk personally reviewed hiring decisions. Everyone knew the rule. It was never debated. It never needed to be stated out loud. On the surface, this exclusion appeared invisible. There were no arguments, no confrontations, no angry statements. Viewers saw consistency, not discrimination, familiar faces, familiar sounds, and the same arrangement week after week. Calm television. That calm is what troubled Sullivan. By 1964, Sullivan had begun consciously integrating not only performers, but also his production staff. When Welk appeared on his show, the contrast was unmistakable. According to backstage accounts, Welk remarked that Sullivan's orchestra looked different from what he was used to. It was not said with anger. It did not need to be. To Sullivan, the problem was not just the exclusion itself. It was the lack of awareness. Welk seemed genuinely confused by criticism. He viewed his orchestra's homogeneity as aesthetic preference, not moral choice. A look, a style, something beyond question. That refusal to question disturbed Sullivan more than open hostility ever could. Welk never publicly acknowledged that his hiring practices caused harm. He did not issue statements. He did not revise his policies. He continued presenting an all-white orchestra as normal until his show ended. When he died in 1992, Tributes celebrated his kindness and gentleness. The exclusion that defined his professional life was rarely mentioned. Lawrence Welk's racism did not hide behind charm. It hid behind repetition. Nothing shocking ever happened. That was the point. If discrimination is quiet enough to feel normal and consistent enough to feel intentional, does it stop being visible, or does it simply stop being questioned? Gene Autry sold himself as a lesson. On The Ed Sullivan Show, he appeared as the singing cowboy who stood for fairness, kindness, and decency. His cowboy code preached helping the weak, playing fair, and doing what was right. To generations of children, Autry was not just entertainment, he was moral instruction. That image did not extend to how his empire operated. Behind the scenes, Autry used his wealth and influence to maintain rigid racial separation across nearly every corner of his business. From radio to television to live events, the pattern was consistent. According to internal documents and former employees, Autry's companies enforced policies that excluded Black Americans from visibility, opportunity, and authority. Autry owned multiple radio stations beginning in the years after 1940. Station memos from 1952 outlined clear rules. Music by Black artists was not to be played, regardless of popularity. This was not market hesitation. It was instruction. Songs that dominated charts elsewhere were filtered out by policy. His television production company followed the same logic. Over hundreds of episodes, casts remained entirely white. Production records show that Autry personally approved casting decisions. Not a single Black actor appeared in a speaking role under his control. Employees later described the rule as unwritten but universally understood. Live events reflected the same structure. Autry's rodeos enforced segregated seating where segregation remained legal. Unlike some touring acts who refused to perform under those conditions, Autry's management accepted local laws without protest. Order was maintained. The show went on. What made this especially revealing was how quiet it all was. Autry rarely spoke publicly about race. He did not deliver speeches. He did not shout opposition. When asked to support integrated housing initiatives in 1956, he declined, citing concerns about property values. Language activists recognized as a coded defense of segregation. The decision carried weight precisely because it sounded reasonable. In 1961, Autry purchased the California Angels. Under his ownership, the team developed a reputation as reluctant to sign Black players. Several Black athletes later described the organization as unwelcoming, a place where advancement felt limited even when performance was strong. No official policy was ever announced. None was needed. According to people who worked inside Autry's companies, he did not need to explain his preferences. Everyone already understood them. He did not have to say no. His empire spoke for him. That reality troubled Sullivan. Sullivan had grown up watching Autry's films. Like many Americans, he associated the cowboy with honesty and fairness. Seeing how completely those values stopped at the edge of Autry's business operations forced Sullivan to confront the difference between image and power. Autry's segregation was not emotional. It was administrative. He died in 1998 with his wholesome reputation largely intact. Tributes focused on his generosity and his influence on American entertainment. The systems of exclusion he maintained were rarely addressed. And that may be the most unsettling part. When discrimination is enforced through contracts, memos, and silence without cruelty, without spectacle, who is left to challenge it? If a man teaches fairness to children while denying it to adults, where does responsibility truly begin? This was the one Ed Sullivan never stopped thinking about. When Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show for the first time on the 9th of September 1956, television history changed. More than 60 million viewers tuned in. It was not just a performance, it was a coronation. In that moment, Sullivan did not merely introduce a singer, he crowned a king. At the time, Sullivan believed he was managing risk. Elvis was controversial, sexual, unpredictable. Booking him was seen as a gamble. What Sullivan did not yet understand was that the greater risk was not Elvis's hips, it was the power being handed to him. Elvis built his career on Black music. That fact is not disputed. He studied gospel in black churches in Memphis. He learned phrasing, movement, and rhythm on Beale Street. Rock and roll itself was a black innovation long before Elvis made it profitable for white audiences. His sound, his style, his success, all were deeply indebted to black artists. But that debt never became advocacy. According to multiple accounts from musicians and staff who worked around Elvis, his personal attitudes toward black people were sharply disconnected from his professional reliance on black culture. Several sources documented Elvis using dismissive and derogatory language in private settings. While Elvis later denied some of these statements, black musicians active in Memphis during his rise recalled hearing similar sentiments expressed by him or by those closest to him. What remains undisputed is what Elvis did not do. He did not publicly credit the black artists who shaped his music. He did not use his platform to support integration. He did not speak during the Montgomery bus boycott. He did not stand with black performers during the integration crisis in Little Rock. At a moment when millions of young Americans were forming their views on race, Elvis remained silent. That silence mattered. Sam Phillips, the producer who discovered Elvis, later acknowledged that Elvis was uncomfortable discussing his musical debt. He preferred the myth of originality. King spoke carefully about Elvis, noting that while he was personally cordial, he avoided any public association that might suggest mentorship or shared lineage. Little Richard was less restrained, repeatedly stating that Elvis took from black music while refusing to acknowledge those who created it. Behind the scenes, that distance was visible. According to Graceland staff, Elvis maintained largely segregated social circles throughout his life. Black employees were present, but almost exclusively in service roles. On The Ed Sullivan Show, crew members who worked all three of Elvis's appearances later recalled his visible discomfort around black staff. A stage manager documented that Elvis gravitated toward white crew members, creating an atmosphere that felt quietly exclusionary. What made this more painful was the timing. Elvis rose during the birth of the civil rights movement. He had influence no politician could match with white youth. And yet, he used that influence only for himself. Sullivan did not see this clearly at first. He was focused on ratings, contracts, and controlling a live broadcast. Only later, as he began consciously featuring more black performers and paying closer attention to racial justice, did the weight of those Elvis bookings settle in. According to his wife, Sylvia, Sullivan would watch civil rights footage in the years after 1960 and comment on Elvis. "I made him America's idol," he reportedly said, and he never once used that power for good. A moment in 1968 confirmed for Sullivan that nothing had changed. During Elvis's comeback special, NBC crew members reported objections to black dancers appearing in certain segments. Performances were adjusted. Scenes were separated. The crown remained intact. Elvis died in 1977, 3 years after Sullivan. Tributes celebrated his music, his charisma, and his cultural impact. The contradictions between his musical debt and his personal attitudes were rarely addressed. Sullivan could not undo what he had done. He had given Elvis the stage that made him immortal. He had helped shape a generation's idol, and in the end, that was the regret that stayed. Not because Elvis lacked talent, but because the king ruled over borrowed ground and never acknowledged the people beneath it. So the question remains, when someone is given the loudest platform in the country and chooses silence, is that silence neutral, or is it the most powerful choice of all? This story was never about erasing legacies or rewriting history for comfort. Ed Sullivan did not invent racism in entertainment. He did not create the systems that rewarded silence or discouraged confrontation, but he did something just as consequential. He normalized them. For more than 2 decades, Sullivan introduced performers to America as worthy of trust. His stage did not simply reflect popular culture, it shaped it. When someone stood under those lights, talent became authority, and familiarity became approval. In his later years, Sullivan reportedly understood the weight of that power. He could not undo the introductions he had made. He could not take back the crowns once they were placed. What he could do was recognize that entertainment does not exist outside morality, and that neutrality, when paired with power, is rarely neutral at all. The performers in this story were not the same. Some excluded loudly, others politely. Some built segregation through policy, others through silence. But all of them benefited from a system that chose comfort over justice and familiarity over truth. And that system did not survive on performers alone. It survived on applause, on repetition, on audiences choosing not to ask who was missing from the stage or why. Elevation requires participation. Silence requires agreement. This is not a call to cancel the past. It is a call to understand it. Because history does not change when we pretend these contradictions did not exist. It changes when we look at them clearly, without nostalgia, without excuses, and without fear of discomfort. If this story challenged the way you see these icons, leave a comment and share your perspective. If you believe these conversations matter, like the video and subscribe for more examinations of entertainment's complicated past. Because if we only remember the applause, we risk repeating the silence. And silence, as this story shows, has always been one of the most powerful forces of all.